Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Unpotted community series. We are back, we are recharged, and we're ready to chat about a listener's question today. That question is going to be, what does it mean to be self-aware? And this question is a really great question. I think this is going to be a really deep conversation because this is kind of the question of all questions. It's kind of what allows us to exist in the moment is to have self-awareness. So I'll be honest, I like to get into the details of things. And Sophie's really great at opening these kinds of questions with a larger breadth of detail, more open. So I'm going to pass it to Soph to get us started with this question.
Hey everyone, glad to be back at our community series. What does it mean to be self-aware? What a great question. I'm honestly really excited to talk about this one because self-awareness, I think, is something that we don't know we have or we don't know that we're able to tap into until we do, right? Because self-awareness is the ability to be aware of how we're showing up in the world, how we're interacting with our friends, our family, our partners. How much are we aware of the way in which our thoughts are controlling us? And in turn, how that impacts the way we interact with the world. I think self-awareness is so important because without it, what are we? We're unaware. We're lost in thought. We are being controlled by our emotions and by our past, and we're not here. We're not grounded. And it's only until we're here and we're grounded that we can really experience what's unfolding in life. So I'm excited for this conversation. I think a good way to start is maybe we can both go through, have we always been self-aware? And I'll go ahead and ask you, Daisy, what is your experience with self-awareness been the past 5 or so years?
That's a great question. And I feel like the last 2 weeks prepared me for this because I feel like I am pretty proactive in the recent years of keeping my thoughts at an arm's length and not believing them to be factual, understanding that they don't have to be taken seriously. I don't have to heavily invest in them. But the last 2 weeks, I got totally lost in them. And that was more of a reflection how I used to spend most of my life. And to paint a picture, say in college, I did really poorly in a class. I would think that I was stupid. I wouldn't be able to separate this experience from who I was as a person. Same with friendships, same with being in groups of people, same with all of this. I would take things very personal and as very matter of fact about saying, I am this. If I'm feeling quiet today, everyone's going to think that I'm awkward, and that's factual. I am awkward then. These are the thoughts that without self-awareness, I used to live within, and they used to control me. And I started to question this more at 25. I started to say, hey, maybe who I am is not who I think I am. And maybe this heavy weight I carry around with this idea of who I think I am is not true. And I think the reality was that started with having self-compassion for myself, because without having, I think, that self-compassion, everything just becomes a concept. It's not necessarily experienced out of de-arming the weight from weighing on your body, weighing on your psyche, weighing on your consciousness, weighing on pulling you down. And I think reality is, without someone telling us that maybe life isn't what we think it is, it's very easy to live our lives through the lens of what everyone always told us we were, and through the experiences that informed our idea of ourself. And all of that leading up to this experience where, the last 2 weeks I was taking my thoughts very serious and I was letting them heavily weigh me down. But after reflecting and journaling and connecting and self-expression the past 48 hours, I'm able to see oh, right. This is nothing more than me taking my thoughts really serious and overinvesting in the realness and the truth that comes with it. And the reality is I could have done this at any moment in the last 2 weeks. I just decided not to, because I was so invested in the idea that I was overwhelmed and that I couldn't be vulnerable and X, Y, and Z. The list goes on. So for me, what broke this pattern of heaviness, of weight, of carrying the weight of the world and feeling like, you know, maybe somewhat hopeless or feeling somewhat stuck or not excited or gray, feeling like a gray scale of 2, 3 different colors, was nothing more than me getting fixated on learned experiences of the idea of who I was.
Can you say that in simpler terms, just for anyone who's listening who may not understand like what the idea of yourself means, or someone who has never listened to this podcast? Can you just say that like a little simpler?
Yeah, I would say that in the last 2 weeks, I was just really in my head. I was really in my thoughts, and my mind was racing and was really anxious, and I couldn't get out of it. And it was like a roller coaster. It was like a hula hoop of non-stop thought loops. And I just couldn't get out of it. And they weighed me down. And I think anyone who's listening to this podcast or may have an interest in this podcast is someone who maybe wrestles with their overactive thoughts. And that's really what I mean, is that my thoughts were really overactive. And I was in the front row seat to my thoughts versus being in the nosebleeds. And they were me. I was experiencing these thoughts with no separation. And I don't know how to say that any simpler. I think that, the closer we are to our thoughts, the closer we are to feeling the pinnacle of anxiety, to feeling there's no separation between us and these thoughts. And that is the feeling of being anxious. That is the feeling of being overwhelmed and thinking there is no escape. That is when we are taking our thoughts as fact.
So to echo off that, I'd say self-awareness comes when we can recognize the ways in which we have been caught up. And it's interesting you're describing it, I think, from a very focused lens of, generally speaking, like the most important thing we do in this journey is recognizing we're not our thoughts. And then within the different levels of self-awareness, I would say, for me, self-awareness started probably 5 years ago, when I started saying there has to be more to life. Like there has to be more to life than the life I'm living. So if we're going to make self-awareness kind of like a gradual scale of any sort, not that it is, because ultimately awareness is awareness, but we can deepen our knowledge. We can deepen our understanding. So me, when I was 25 years old and I first started questioning my sexuality, I became aware that I was maybe suppressing this part of myself. And I would say that is the first time in which I really was aware of myself, or at least the idea of myself, and the way in which I was not attuned or I was disconnected from that. And I think that was kind of the first entry point to me questioning the way I've been living my life and questioning society, questioning what I've been told by my parents, what I've been told by the world, what I've been told, and the ways in which I think I should live my life. And I think from there, if that's the entry, I think maybe it's important to note that we can wake up at any moment, but I think a lot of the times our entry way into awareness, into self-awareness, is some sort of experience that we have that makes us question the way we've been living, right? Maybe that's a death in the family, or maybe that's you lose your job, or maybe for me, it was something that just felt so not aligned. So I think after that, after me recognizing all of that and being like, whoa, okay, so being like, okay, there's 25 years old Sophie, right? And there's also all these other years of Sophie, of who I have been, how I've showed up in the world. And I think that understanding for me kind of created this contrast to understand. So this means as we're living life, it's possible to not be living in a way that is true to us. understanding, now having this new understanding that there is something that I wanted to access, meaning tapping into my sexuality, tapping into this true part of who I really was that I haven't been accessing, created the parallel or the contrast to understand that it's possible in life that the reality we're living right now is not the only reality to live. And I kind of think that that's what self awareness does. It makes you question what you're doing in life and ask the big questions of whose life I've been living. Where do I really want to live? What do I really want to do? Who am I really attracted to? Right? And then I think from there, that's probably like the really broader sense of asking these big questions. And I think as we go deeper, continue to go deeper into the here and now, like you're describing, I think we kind of end up in assessing in every given moment, not necessarily where do I want to live or what career do I want, but how am I showing up right now? How am I treating the people in my life? How am I projecting those emotions? So I think it's kind of helpful to show it as a scale. Maybe we go from broader to more narrow in the sense of self-awareness is something that there's maybe different levels of it, but I think if to someone who maybe feels like they're not self-aware is just really the understanding of understanding what is happening right now. Because I think it's really easy to live our lives not understanding that.
So it's interesting because I feel like we kind of came at this from different angles, which makes sense because we have different experiences. But I really like what you said about how self-awareness really for you began with the simple act of asking questions. And I like how you just kind of said on a scale, there's different kinds of questions you can ask yourself. And the number one question being, what's stopping me from being in this moment? Not focusing so much on questions of where am I going to live? Who am I going to marry? Who am I going to have kids? Am I going to do this? Like those questions are very much focused in the future. And I really like what you said about how these questions that you've honed in on to start on the scale of life of question asking is really narrowing in those questions for this exact moment. And I really like that angle because it can be really difficult to find yourself in the present moment, especially when you were or you are in a position like I was the past 2 weeks where I felt like I was just constantly in an entanglement of my thoughts. And using this skill that you just mentioned of asking questions about the present moment can really help you broaden your world and your expansiveness of what you are experiencing because everything can only be experienced in this moment. And just on the antithesis of that, what I found myself doing when I was so caught up in my thoughts was that I was caught up in the idea of, quote unquote, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Whether that's in finding happiness through doing a certain project with the house, doing a certain project with getting an herb cabinet, with getting shelves in the wall. My point in saying this is that when we're anxious, we do tend to ask ourselves questions of what can make me happy? What can make me happy? But it's easy for that to live in the future of what can I do now to make me happy in 5 days? What can I do now to make me happy in the future? But what you said was ask questions about yourself, what you can do in this moment. So it's a question of what can I do right now? Why am I feeling off right now? Should I just sit? Should I journal? Am I overinvested in my thoughts? And if that's the case, if I don't know what that means yet, can I just write my thoughts out and get them out of my head so I can have separation? I think maybe that's why journaling is so great because you see your thoughts separate from you once you get them out on paper, and that can help you process them. That can help bring you into this moment. So I really liked how you just clarified and specified the active questions because I can see how that would be misinterpreted to ask ourselves questions about what can make us happy, but it's more so asking ourselves questions in this moment, like what do my jeans feel like as I rub them? Like things that can really bring us back to this moment because that is where self-awareness is. It's when we can come into this moment or we can be aware, we can start to become observant of the crazy thoughts that we are believing.
Yeah, and I think another really big one is self-awareness in the way in which we interact with other people. Because we spend so much of our lives interacting, whether in a relationship or with our friends or our family. And I think a really big one for me was the self-awareness that I had a tendency to want to control other people. I had a tendency to want to control outcomes, control maybe if someone was saying something that was uncomfortable or implicated me having to open up. Like, I feel like I spent a lot of my life kind of hiding who I really was. Like, I used to not want to talk about my sexuality. I was so scared to talk about that. So I would kind of try to deviate conversation so that they wouldn't have to bring me back to me having to talk about myself. And I seen that, I think that started with childhood, really, like being scared to talk to my parents or being scared to be honest with my parents about what was happening because my parents were pretty strict. But kind of this habit I developed over the years of wanting to avoid talking about myself, wanting to avoid showing up as me. And I think a lot of that turned into wanting to control other people and maybe asking questions in ways that would deviate from me having to be present in what was really happening. So, also defensiveness. That's a big one for me. Like being defensive, if somebody said something that implicated something that maybe I had to change about myself. I'm trying to think of an example. Like if you're like, Sophie, you're being kind of harsh right now. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, you're just being sensitive. That's a big one. Like, why am I not able to hear what this person's saying about me? And maybe I am being harsh, but my default way of responding was to undermine what they were saying by saying, no, you're wrong. That's a huge one. And I saw this a lot in my dad growing up, and I saw this a lot in other people growing up, of just kind of like the inability to look at ourselves. And I think that is the key in self-awareness, is saying, okay, maybe what this person's telling you about you is true. Maybe the way that they're saying, hey, you're making me feel a certain way, or you're causing this XYZ. And yes, we can understand that, of course, like we're always responsible for our own emotions. But in terms of an awareness level of understanding, how are we showing up in the world? How are we responding in ways that maybe are implicating other people? Because I think a big thing you get from self-awareness is empathy. Understanding it's not just about you. And maybe the most important thing, and it's kind of the irony of self-awareness, we talk about the self, being aware of the self, is recognizing how important it really is the self. How important is this idea that you're trying so hard to maintain, that I'm so scared to accept that maybe I am being controlling, or maybe I am being aggressive, or maybe I am undermining you, because I'm so scared to confront that maybe there is something wrong with me. But the reality of it is there's never anything wrong with me. But just the whole idea of how we just don't want to accept how we're showing up in our dynamics.
Well, is that a sign that we are over invested in the idea of ourselves in that moment? And by that, I mean, we have settled upon idea of ourselves that is comfortable, and anyone who threatens that is factual is threatening our idea of perceived certainty. And by that, I mean, we are taking something really serious. Think of someone in your life. Maybe it's an older person in your life. Maybe it's a grandparent, someone who just doesn't take anything seriously. They'll laugh at anything, and take that person and compare it to you, like this example that Sophie painted of someone saying, you just hurt my feelings. Like, why did you say that? And them being like, well, you're just too sensitive. This is what I said, and I said it. So whatever. It's interesting because you could, in theory, in that example, laugh and be like, oh, sometimes I can be harsh, and that's okay. And like kind of laugh at yourself about it and be like, are you okay? And it's interesting because when you are super defensive, it is offending this idea you have of yourself. And with that comes, in a way, rigidity and suffering, because at all costs, you will defend this truth, quote unquote truth, to ensure you're comfortable in this idea of yourself. Because oftentimes it's easy to settle upon an idea of ourselves to be ultra comfortable, even if we are suffering, even if we're not happy, even if it has negative implications on our relationships. So I think it's just a reminder, if you have the urge to get mad at someone, are you taking the idea as to why you want to get mad at them too serious? Like, an ongoing thing for me is noises. of all kinds. And something that I do when I hear noises that inherently trigger me initially, I say, what's the narrative here? The narrative is that I had an intense upbringing where I heard a lot of noises, and yeah, there's truth to that, where my body reacts intensely to noises. But I can acknowledge that without leaning heavily into it and reliving it and making it factual. I can acknowledge that that's true, and I can say, but that's okay. I'll move on, right? It's easy to get ultra triggered by things when you say, yep, this happened, and that's why I'm this way, and that's just how I am. You're defending an idea of yourself, even if it perpetuates suffering, where it can be very uncomfortable when you're triggered by something, in this case, maybe a noise, and you feel attacked. And you think, well, that's silly, isn't it? Because look at where I'm at. Look at who's making the noise. They would never inherently try to attack me. And it's interesting. Yeah, you, Sophie. So it's interesting to question that initial trigger, because you can kind of be like, wait, that's silly. But again, going back to what you said earlier of becoming self-aware, it's asking questions in the present moment to separate yourself from your thoughts and from taking them too seriously.
Well, it's really taking accountability. Like, it's taking accountability and responsibility. I think self-awareness goes hand in hand with accountability. Self-awareness is saying that maybe I feel really annoyed right now. Maybe I feel really frustrated right now, but I'm not going to react. I think self-awareness is staying open, no matter how triggered you are. And I feel like we haven't talked much about triggers recently, but that is like so much part of this whole conversation is becoming aware of the way in which we react to other people, becoming aware of the way in which we want to close, becoming aware of our tendencies to feel like I even noticed this like earlier today, like there's this dynamic situation I have when like I'll walk into a room, or for example, like I walked into the apartment today and I was like really in my vibe. I was listening to music. And I noticed this tendency in the past where maybe like someone would say something to me, like my mom or something, that would kind of make me feel triggered and make me feel like I can't stay in that experience. Like I can't keep vibing out. I have to shut down. And I've noticed that a lot just in our relationship, Daisy, or just in my experiences with other people, like feeling attacked, feeling like threatened, feeling like somebody wants me to suffer. That's a huge one that I've experienced, is thinking that somebody else wants me to suffer. So I've noticed that come up a lot, of just like the feeling of, I can't really think of a good example. Like, do you know what I mean? Like that feeling of in a dynamic with another person, all of a sudden I feel disappointed, or all of a sudden I feel angry, or all of a sudden I feel mad. And it's like, I can either follow that emotion and stay mad because I think I'm right in that. I think that's what's actually happening. Or self-awareness comes in and it goes, wait a minute. You don't have to respond that way. That person's not trying to hurt you. No one's trying to hurt you right now. You just are thinking it to be other than what it really is.
That's really interesting, because when you walked in from your walk, I was trying to figure out, like, is she angry? Is she mad? Like, and that's just like my own, I do that sometimes. Like when people get home, like I try to figure out, are they coming in angry? Do I have to change my state? And that's why I kind of was like watching you. Sometimes I can't tell. Like I couldn't tell, like if you were just like kind of in your zone listening to music, and like that's great. Or I couldn't tell if you're storming in and you were angry and mad, and if I needed to like change my state. And within like a minute, I was able to recognize, oh, like there's no animosity here. There's no anger here. She's just existing. So I was set free. I was like, okay, so I can just exist because she's just existing. There's no energy. There's no emotion that is being projected outward from her. I misinterpreted that as her just feeling intense and excited about whatever she is excited about, whatever you're excited about. So I think that's just on the other side of it, both of our patterns kind of merging together. So I was just kind of explaining my experience with that, because it shows the other side of it, and how my experience is to inherently think that someone is attacking me, which is funny because that's what your experience, you thought, was when you walked in, because maybe you're used to being shut down for being yourself. I don't know. But it's interesting how both of these things can manifest into different things, different actions, different outcomes of being super outward and talking a lot and singing versus shrinking and becoming small. But it's at its core the same thing, the emotion you're feeling from it. So without self-awareness, this could be a collusion of emotions. But with both of us having self-awareness, we are able to both quickly check out of the initial reaction that we are hardwired to respond to these interactions with.
Okay, so I think this one is really interesting, and I think it's really making me think about being a child and like coming home and maybe being excited about something, and then one of my parents not being excited about it. And I don't know if I really had this on an intense level in childhood, but I definitely remember whether that was a friend or somebody in which I was really excited about something and the other person like wasn't equally as excited. And I've seen this trigger come up like to this day of kind of almost wanting someone else to see me or wanting validation from somebody, and like paint the picture of like, so I come into the apartment and I'm feeling really excited about something. And then you're there and you're kind of like not. And all of a sudden I get mad that you're in a bad mood. But it's almost like, why do I care what mood you're in? And then you could flip it on that. Like, why do you care what mood I'm in when I walk in? Like, why are we?
Well, I think it's a sign of a lack of accountability in that moment. You're falling victim to
For both parties, right?
For both parties, yeah.
Yeah.
You're falling victim to taking what it is you're feeling very seriously. And this person, from being on the opposite spectrum, is threatening your current experience. That makes sense?
Why do we feel so threatened in our experience by other people why do we feel so threatened that like my state has to change because of somebody else? Like, and I look back, like I remember like a one big one I would see is at my old job, like coming in, feeling really excited, feeling like I have my music on and getting to my job and having to turn it off and being really annoyed because like I didn't want to be there. But I think going back earlier, it's like, maybe being told like, oh, you're being annoying, or maybe like being told that, oh, that's, like expressing ourselves, or the way in which like we like judge people who dance on the streets. Just kind of the way in which I think generally speaking, when there's a lot of pain in this world, and I think a lot of that pain manifests in maybe parents who raise us saying, you can't be that way. If you're expressing yourself, if you're singing, if you're dancing, like you have to shut it down. I don't want to see that because it triggers their own pain. So I think it almost feels like for me a lot of the times, like feel like I'm walking kind of on eggshells in a way of, and I wonder if this is just what I've picked up from you, because I know you have from your growing up and your life and your dynamics to authority or whatever. Like, I don't know if I even had this before our relationship. I can't remember, but I do remember feeling threatened and feeling defensive. So maybe our relationship just brought to light what was already in me. And it doesn't matter where it comes from, but it's there nonetheless. So,
well, relationships are always going to bring up what is inherently there because that's what relationships do. That's why relationships are so hard, because it brings up the depths of the things that you want to hide. And to have a true relationship that's open and safe, you have to work through those things, or else you're going to bring them into the relationship and hurt the other person and break the trust that you've built and the loyalty that you've built. So I think that's why relationships can be such a proponent of waking up, healing, taking accountability, recreating the narrative, because there is a constant driving force. There is a constant mirror being held up to you that you're seeing your reflection and you're being told that X, Y, and Z is happening, and you're seeing how it impacts your relationship, and no one wants that to happen. So it forces you in a way to have self-awareness, because someone is telling you, this bothers me. And maybe you would have never known that because you wouldn't have had the self-awareness if someone else hadn't been impacted by it and brought it to your attention. So I think relationships can help bring self-awareness when one party is able to see you and see the things that you've normalized, and for them to be like, are you sure? Like, what is this? And you're like, I've never thought of it. I thought that's just what was. So it's interesting how that can happen. And from there, you can choose to either not or to take accountability. And by not taking accountability, you're still projecting that thing onto the other person, saying it's them, it's their fault, it's because of them that I feel this way, it's because of them that life feels hard. When in reality, that's a diversion of taking accountability for yourself. And when you take accountability for yourself, you'll watch yourself grow and you'll watch your relationship become a healthy, loving environment, because you're going to be working through something maybe for the first time in your life that you otherwise wouldn't have. And there's this person here to help you reform an idea of what it means to have love in a relationship, what it means to show up authentically, what it means to show up safely. So it's interesting how we've fit relationships into this understanding of self-awareness and accountability, because in a way, that's all relationships are at its core, at its foundation, I mean, right? Like that is the foundation of a relationship. If either parties have baggage, which who doesn't, they have to be worked through individually and collectively and reevaluated individually and collectively.
Well, it's really making me think of like my dad and like how my dad would just, he always like starts every conversation just saying no. Like the ego and trying to prove a point constantly. And I feel like I went down that path for so long, and maybe I learned that from my dad of ego, power. I was a lawyer, and almost like I struggled to take into account other people's feelings because I was so fixated on confirming the belief that I had about the world. And I see this with my dad so much, like the inability to look at yourself and say, maybe the belief that I have about the world, about you, about life, about thinking, like I think of my dad used to saying like, no, this is right. There's such thing as this is the right way, this is the right path, this is the right thing to do. Oh no, this is fact. He would always say my opinion is fact. And I'm just like, how could our opinions ever be fact? Like as soon as we're settling on anything in life, as soon as we're believing anything as true and we're holding that conviction, we have to pause, because that's where the self-awareness comes in, to go that, to recognize that our conviction in anything are extreme. And there's a difference here, I think, in passion. And I've seen this too with myself, because I am somebody who gets really passionate. But there's a difference in being passionate and excited about what you're talking about and being angry. That if you prove me wrong, I'm going to be upset. So you have to agree with me. You have to agree with me. You have to keep agreeing with me, because if you don't agree with me, then I'm going to have to look at myself and recognize maybe I'm hurt. So I think this one is huge. I don't even know what you would call this subsection of self-awareness. I think kind of our inability to look at ourselves, which I think is the overarching theme of what self-awareness is looking at yourself and recognizing that your point of view is not the only point of view. And this can be really, really hard when we're living in survival mode or we're so self-obsessed. And a lot of the time, I think I would argue all of the time, it's rooted in pain. I can't open myself up to understand maybe I'm in the wrong because I am so deeply hurt about the way I've been treated in the past. And so the cycle continues. And we end up living in a world of people who are completely unaware, who are on autopilot, who are on survival mode, who don't understand what's unfolding because we're just trying to get by because we're so hurt, and our only way to respond is to defend. So I think self-awareness is recognizing that, like Michael Singer says, have I mentioned him in a while, staying open, even when it's so painful, even when like I've had so many moments recently, all I want to do is close, and just staying open. Even though I came home yesterday and you went to the grocery store and you didn't get peanut butter and I wanted to close because I was like, why didn't you buy that? I asked, but I was like, it's silly. I'm not, and I moved on. And that's the key with self-awareness, is how quickly we can move on is what grows. How we don't get as angry as we used to.
Yeah, it's really up to you. And I think having self-awareness at its core It allows you to enjoy the moments in your life that you otherwise would respond to in a state of unawareness, which is in a state of reaction. And when you respond to life in a state of reaction, you're falling victim to whatever life throws at you in a way that you're going to respond out of innate memory instead of conscious awareness. And when you do that, when it isn't through conscious awareness, you're not going to feel like you have any control of your life, which is the furthest thing from the truth. Because once you're able to not respond to things in a reactionary way, what's there really to be upset about? What's there really to be concerned about? You have the option on how you want your life to be. And that might mean that you'll have momentary levels of discomfort because you get triggered, and instead of reacting and projecting them onto someone else, which can lead to hours and days of just continued past back and forth anger, you can have that momentary discomfort, which can be empowering, which that's accountability, which allows you to take control of your life and actually see enjoyable experiences manifest. And we start to not need the thing that's coming to come anymore, because now that you are not just reacting in each and every single moment based off preconceived ideas of who you are from things that happen to you, when you do not do that and you instead absorb the trigger and say, okay, and you move on, your life is going to look a lot different, because you're not going to be putting out the negative victim, I'm not in control energy. And instead, you're going to put out an energy of, right, you're going to tell the thoughts in your brain, and you're going to create those neural pathways in your brain that, right, I can handle this. Okay, they didn't mean it like that. Like, I just am reacting this way in my mind, and it's okay, I can move on. You're going to create a lot more self-compassion for yourself. You're going to learn to take accountability, and you're going to associate the discomfort that comes with taking accountability with freedom, empowerment, and an overall upward curve of your life, of your quality of life. So I think that's where I want to end it. That's what I feel great about, like leaving the message with the listener of, it's uncomfortable at first to take accountability. First, you have to have the awareness, which you have to pause to do that. You have to observe your thoughts to do that. And once you observe those thoughts and keep them at a distance, what comes in hand with that is taking accountability for how observing those thoughts might make you feel. And that's going to feel uncomfortable. And that's okay, because everything feels uncomfortable when you first start. When you first start running, you can't even fathom running a mile. But before you know it, you just run the next foot in front of the other. And before you know it, you can run 5 miles because you worked your way up there and you didn't judge yourself. You just experienced the moment and you did what you had to do in that moment, despite how it maybe made you feel. Maybe it was uncomfortable, but you just kept going forward. And I think that inherently is a lesson in itself, because that is a lesson in having separation between your thoughts and you, because you are not reacting to them instantaneously upon hearing them. You're taking a pause and you're saying, right, I had that thought, but I'm going to keep doing this because I know the outcome is for me to have a happier life.
And I feel really uncomfortable, but it's not from the other person. I feel really angry and annoyed and frustrated, and it's not from anyone else but myself. That is the takeaway for me too. And maybe it's one I've actually kind of lost sight of. I don't think I've revisited this topic, which is funny because I think it is important to always remind ourselves, like, the kind of the basics of all of this. And one being, no one else is responsible for your emotions, for your happiness, for your contentment. And that can be really hard to hear at first, because unfortunately we go through really hard situations in life. And that leaves us in places where we are triggered, where we are hurt, where we do have pain. But the more that we can take accountability for right here, right now, January, whatever, 2024, not in the past, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, not next week, now. the more that we can live a life more full of love and honestly have fun. The more we could just have fun and not take things so seriously. Like, you think of people who are so rigid. It's like, why are you so rigid? Because you're taking it so damn seriously. Let go. Allow yourself to relax. And I think that's what self-awareness is. And I think to close out the episode, it's a really great question. I really love this question. Is self-awareness starts when we become aware of the ways in which we are responding. Self-awareness starts when we become aware of how we're reacting, that we feel triggered when someone says something, that we feel hurt when an expectation is not met, that we feel frustrated when things don't go our way. Self-awareness is recognizing that the thing in which you are attributing your feeling to is not where your frustration or suffering is coming from. It's recognizing that it's you. It's always you. And I know that could be a very unsettling answer to have, but it's not, because it is empowering, because you are the one who can change your life. If we wait for every external force in life to get perfect, if we wait for every external circumstances to align perfectly to curate this very specific life where nothing ever bothers you, you'll be walking on eggshells your entire life. It is you who has to take the accountability. It is you who has to take the responsibility. And I say this talking to myself. I'm always just talking to myself on this podcast because I'm going through this actively. Daisy and I both are. I think self-awareness is one in which we can easily tap into, but it's a lifelong journey of continuing to cultivate it. So thank you to the listener for such a thought-provoking conversation. This was incredible to talk about. I'm also just feeling a lot more aware than normal because we're back in Austin. We're back after vacation, and I'm thinking it's really hard to be self-aware when you're on vacation. Something about being back into flow, and like, I'm curious, someone might feel otherwise, but having something that grounds you and pushes yourself and doing something uncomfortable allows you to go, oh, I've been so caught up in my head.
But there is also the experience of getting so caught up in it that you learn a lot, that you otherwise wouldn't get caught up in it if you were super grounded. And it makes you have a newfound gratitude for these practices that help you stay grounded, because I have a new appreciation for this podcast and what it does for me. And I can understand
I agree. I feel the same exact way.
And I can understand that this podcast would be helpful because I can just understand that now. I don't judge that the way I used to, because I really see how in normal, typical, standard American life, these topics are not talked about. I see that. I see how easy it is to fall out of shit, out of the great realm of self-awareness when you just sit and do nothing. And we did nothing for 2 weeks. And it was hell. But I learned a lot from that. So self-awareness is a life-changing tool or skill that I've developed. And I think this podcast and the consistency of us talking about our thoughts and getting them out there has been extremely helpful. And I think the creation of anything, whether it's content, whether it's writings, whether it's photographing, whether it's literally anything, it's a form of self-expression, which I feel like can help create a form of self-awareness, just on a side note, because you're taking the thoughts and the inner workings of yourself and you're putting them onto something else. You see them differently than you experience them. So on that note, I do too want to thank the listener for this question. It was really thought-provoking and interesting, and feeling really in the groove and excited to be back podcasting with you all. And we're excited to keep releasing episodes, and for the community Zooms that are every Tuesday, really looking forward to those. So stay tuned. We'll be back next week, and have a great weekend, and hope you're able to maintain a sense of self-awareness.
Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll talk to you again on Tuesday. Cheers.